Hey YouTube, it's Dimitri, and today we're going to have a more serious discussion here. I've been advised by close friends and advisors for years now, so I've wanted to make this video for years. I just haven't made it because I've taken advice from a lot of these individuals, but I can't stand by and let this nonsense continue on without saying something, without stepping up, at least making these sort of issues more transparent, but also looking at this from a quant perspective here. So again, we're going to look at the quant industry at the end of this, but also looking at data here. We're just not looking at data anymore. Everyone's just running with, feelings and emotions, and then things get skewed, and then they compound, and then we have problems that don't really, exist in the stance that we think they exist because there's just so much compounding of emotions and feelings rolling into this, and yet we're just throwing data by the wayside. So today I'm going to talk about the issue with social justice in banking and finance. It is ruining the banking industry, so I'm going to lay that out up front. It's going to be quite damaging in the long run. And I think executives at most banks, there are some banks that are doing a great job, but most banks are just cowards and are kind of hiding behind these policies, trying to use it as a marketing ploy to feel like they get their employees, they get their customers, right? They need business. They're trying to get people to kind of come and talk to them and bring in, those funds. There are some good initiatives going on that are actually, I would say, more driven by actual interest, care, and insight. And again, are probably backed by more data. But the majority of these sort of issues are just kind of crumbling around the banking industry as they're falling into the political pockets of the far extremist left here on these social justice causes. So let's just dive on in here with a description here, at least a definition of social justice. Before we even get going, we're going to need these definitions so that we can kind of stay in our lane and not get too wrapped up on emotional kind of pieces of this here. So social justice, according to the internet, is justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. Okay, so that's going to be our definition here we're going to be working with. The first key point we need to look at is the system itself actually broken? So one of the big differences, one of the targets you're up to look at here, some people are wanting an equality of outcome, okay, versus an equality of rights. These are very, very different things. So America, the principles it's built on, focuses on the opportunity piece at the beginning. So you have opportunities. Again, these are dynamic and complex in a real world society. You can't say everybody out there can be anything they want. So I know this comes shocking to a lot of people, but I mean, you look at me, I'm short. I don't know if you can tell from this. I cannot play basketball. I'm not super athletic. I cannot play football, right? I'm never going to be a professional athlete. There are other things, for example, like the medical industry. I was planning on wanting to be a surgeon. I cannot handle blood. I'm sorry, it's just not who I am. I get lightheaded, I can faint. Again, there's all these sorts of things that are unique to the individual. And so you need to figure out what your skills are. And so you pick and choose what you want to do here, okay? There are all kinds of opportunities. Everybody's unique. And I think we need to focus on the uniqueness and not on the equality piece here. I'm not going to get into the generational effects as well, because those are dynamic and should be considered as well. So for example, if your parents make a lot of sacrifices, they don't have a lot of opportunities, but they position their children in a great position, right? So now you're going to strip away and level their opportunities because you think it's unfair that they have obtained them. Again, these are going to be the differencing between opportunities of kind of like the beginning of the game here, right? Trying to see if you can make decisions based on what you have versus, and that's kind of like that American ideology of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, versus let's just screw the whole system over. Let's just make everybody equal. Let's just make sure everybody gets the exact same thing at the end of the day. And it doesn't matter that some guy slaved away or some woman threw away their entire family life, right? Worked hundreds of hours every week, are stressed, are going to die young, but maybe are happy that they built an amazing career. And we'll just pay them the exact same as somebody else who has completely different goals, which are just as viable. But those goals might be to spend time with family and build a family environment and make sure your kids have, a really great childhood. All right, the first example, you're not really going to want to be their child because they're never going to be home to spend time with you. The second one would be amazing to be in their family. But again, people have different goals, different opportunities here. And I think part of this needs to focus back on the individual. You'll see here in a second. I'm really sick of the prejudices and the stereotyping that goes along as well. So I hear this constantly. People get very upset when you stereotype, right? So the average X. So this average group of, let's say, an individual. And, they apply something to that and they say, oh, it's unjust and unfair because this group makes less money. This group has less education. This group, but then again, you have to think about it, right? You're just being basically racist in a way or prejudiced based on different groupings. You could be sexist, for example, as well. You're just creating a stereotype so you're using stereotypes to leverage the system to make a point, but then at the same time, you're upset when people are using stereotypes here. So I think the focus and a lot of the issues we're seeing in general with everything is we need to get away from this nonsensical grouping and this segregation that we're starting to see here. And I'll talk a little bit about this in banking. So now we're creating these groups that are competing with each other and it's not fair. And then this group gets more than this group. And it's just a complete nonsensical competition here. Again, we should go back to who is the individual, right? What does the individual put into this? Is this fair? Is this equal based on a specific system here? If people did the exact same thing over and over again, are we seeing they get similar results, right? There's always going to be some luck factor that plays into that. But again, that's what we should be looking at here. And we shouldn't just be saying, oh, we want the exact same opportunity at the beginning, but we also want the exact same opportunity and outcomes at the end. We don't want to accord for like the different efforts that are put in that middle component here. So the first piece here, the first question I'm going to lay out just to think about here is the system broken? And do not provide nonsensical outcome results. So I see this constantly. I say, Dimitri, there is a wealth gap. Do you not understand this? There is a wealth gap, right? There's a gap between genders. There's a gap between races. There's a gap between, I don't know, who knows what. They've picked all these different, I don't know, maybe sexual orientation, for example. The problem with this is, and I'll give an example, a buddy of mine contacted me from a big global corporation and said, hey, I've been assigned to review and look at compensation basically within the corporation and looking for biases. So somewhat of a social justice perspective on this. And he wanted advice from a modeling point of view. So not my political point of view, he wanted a modeling point of view. So I told him, I said, you can start off with doing segregation of data here. So there's segmentation of data, right? Got all these terms tied up in my head now, but it's the same sort of thing here. You end up splitting people out by gender and you say, okay, men make more than women, right? Or this group makes more than this group. And you start pitting these groups against each other. I said, it's okay to look at that as a starting point, but it is not evidence or proof that you have mispricing or mispayment or mistreatment within an organization. So I said, what you have to do is you have to look at a variety of factors and start to ask why, right? So let's say we know for a fact that men make more than women, okay? There's an interesting Harvard study on this, but if you go into it and say, okay, why are they making more? Don't just say they make more, you have to look at why. So for example, how many hours on average are the men working and how many hours on average are the women working, right? Think about that. Think about other sorts of things, for example, as well. Like what sorts of projects are these individuals wanting to take on versus what sorts of projects are they actually taking on, right? So if you're wanting to take on a lot of really high profile projects and no one else wants to take them on, but for some reason you're not getting them, right? And they seem to get delegated to other people, there could be an issue here. Okay, so we need to take this seriously here. There could be an actual discriminatory issue in the workplace. We need to think about that. But at the same time, you need to back up and say, okay, so for example, I'll post a link below to this Harvard study as well, because I think it's one of the better ones done. It's done based on a government organization where promotion's based purely on tenure. And there's a variety of other things, but it tries to avoid all these factors. It's just why real companies like banks are so complex, because there's so many moving parts and like how many hours of overtime you're actually working. So in banking, for example, you don't get paid for overtime. You just work a lot of extra hours, and often it doesn't even pay off. But there are people that just love the career aspect of it. And so a lot of times these people get bumped ahead further and further because of these sorts of projects, this sort of work they're doing. They're working nights, weekends, and all that. But you have to consider all these complexities when you start to model these things. And I think one of the issues we're having is people use summary statistics here. So, right, gender, age, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, for example. They're pulling all these things and just grouping people out and saying A makes more than B, so therefore it's an unfair system. But no one's stopping to look and saying, why is this? And this Harvard studies is extremely interesting because it starts to find out that men typically put in more hours because, right, they're typically the breadwinner of a lot of these families. But then they started breaking this down by other interesting facts, for example, based on if they're married or not. So you think, well, who cares, right? This is discriminatory. You shouldn't look at this. No, it makes a lot of sense. So women that were single were actually making more than women that were married. The reason for this being, again, is a social construct of how things get put together. Women typically spend more time at home in the family. So when there's extra projects, extra hours for that compensation. So again, promotions purely based on tenure here, not based on the projects you took on, but they were being paid hourly. So you would want to work more time because you get paid time and a half. Those without families, for example, on the women's side of it, so it's a whole different aspect, they were working more hours because they wanted to have more money and more freedom. They didn't have a family to go home to, right? They didn't feel that obligation to go back and kind of spend time with their spouse and their kids. Now, men on the other side, again, social constructs, important to look at and understand here, they were actually working more hours than single men. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite, and you're thinking, this is kind of odd. Well, the men that are going to be part of families, again, they want to provide more for their kids, right? You have college tuition coming up, you have lots of expenses, you have things to think about here. So they were ended up working more here. So trying to break these down using data is super, super critical. And I don't see a lot of companies and corporations actually using real world data, making this data transparent. So I see companies releasing data, but their summary statistics, but not trying to break down and understand the actual problem at hand, right? Do we actually have a problem based on the data that we see inside of our firm? So I can't imagine a lot of companies are going to run out there and give you all this industry data here, but you should be looking at your own data in your own systems and figure out how do promotions work internally? How does compensation work, right? Is there a reason, a logical reason on why it's occurring? Or if not, if there's an actual problem here, let's not do the Band-Aid approach. Okay, so I'm super critical on this Band-Aid approach we have, the whole leveling nonsense that goes on throughout, society and the industry and finance as well. Now there's going to be this new approach that a lot of banks are trying to take where it's like, all right, if you're a part of a specific minority group, not even all minorities, if you're a part of very specific minority groups that they handpick and choose, then you're going to get special treatment and you're going to get promotions and special training above and beyond everybody else. And this is going to level the playing field, okay? So it sounds kind of logical at the start, but you start to think about right, how do you measure this? And why is it important that you measure this? Well, because there's all these different minorities. And even whites, for example, the majority here, is what we claim to be at least, they start to talk about this, which is, how do you measure that and how do you account for it? So perhaps, one group is more disadvantaged than another group, right? Now, if you give both of them the same leveling, you're privileging one group over the other one in comparison. So you need to be able to measure that exactly. So you need to figure out exactly where the system's broken. The second logical piece here is, if your organization is racist or sexist or biased, why not fix the problem at the root cause? Instead of saying, okay, we know we have a problem, we don't really want to look at it, like, we're just going to turn a blind eye to this. We're not going to look at the problem, we're just going to try to throw a Band-Aid on it. And instead of actually fixing the unique problem right at the root of that problem and diagnosing exactly how it's supposed to be fixed, you're looking for a cheap shot, big media post saying, hey, look, we donated millions of dollars to social justice. We're going to do all these great things for you guys. Please come to us and be our customers. Come work for us, right? It's really sleazy. It's not fixing the actual problem. If we have an actual problem, again, you need data to look at this. I can tell you from the years of being in the banking industry, I have not seen any extremely overt racist cases, especially systematic in any way, shape, or form. So I've never seen a bank go out and say, okay, this individual has a very specific race, and so we're going to give them either a plus or a minus. I have not seen it, so just to let you know here, and we'll talk about quant finance at the end with actual kind of sampling and numbers from my career itself. But if you have an actual racist problem, why not just fix it? Like, I don't get why we're trying to Band-Aid this and pretend like we have a problem, but we've never looked at the data itself, so we don't know if we really have a problem. And yet we don't want to look at our data either. It's like we're kind of pretending things don't exist. And even when we do, so for example, in Europe, I believe they're trying to make now it mandatory that banks report all this, and companies in general. They're reporting just these demographics, like people in this age make more than people in this age. It's like, well, obviously, older people are going to make more than younger people because they have more experience. And they're trying to do it by gender and race and all these things. It's just nonsense at this point. There's no logical kind of approach to how they're doing this. Like, I would be fine with this, but let's do this scientifically here, especially in quant finance, like we're quants. Banks, for example, have all these quants. They can actually do this work and actually come up with a solid conclusion based on real world data. Again, it should be like an academic paper. Everything should be transparent so people can replicate it and look at it and analyze it here, right? There are a lot of objectives now with people trying to kind of fudge the system, looking for these handout kind of mentality, which is really, really unfortunate and sad. And it goes back down to this. So a lot of people are upset There's a ton of people upset in the finance and banking community. Nobody wants to speak up. Nobody wants to go against the executives because anyone that goes against it, you're going to be labeled as a racist. You're going to be labeled as a sexist. I'm sure in the comments below, I'm going to have people saying, Dimitri, you're a racist. You're a sexist, right? You're a bigot. You're all these things because I don't agree with the nonsensical system that we're going through because we're not looking at actual data here, okay? And again, everyone's going to say, which I've heard a lot of my colleagues say from banks, institutions, friends, classmates, and all this stuff throughout the entire industry here, so it's not any specific firm. They're saying, Dimitri, why can't we just promote people based on merit? Like, isn't this the whole cornerstone and foundation of finance? Isn't this the whole principle and idea of America? And yet I look at them and I think it's common sense, but nobody wants to go back to that. Like, again, with these modelings, let's tear down and look at some key examples of people that are getting promoted and compensation and everything. Let's try to figure out, based on this individual's unique skill sets and abilities, you're going to have to interview their managers and teams to really figure these things out. Are they being compensated correctly? I would argue a lot of your top performers are not being compensated correctly, and a lot of your bottom performers are being overcompensated. But again, why can't we just comp people based on who they are, right? You're an individual. Stop trying to group out and say, well, I'm part of this group and I'm part of this group and I want special treatment for these different things. It is complete nonsense. It's not helping the industry and it's shifting banking, and this is why it's so damaging for finance. So if you haven't realized this by now, right, you can look at MBA scores and placements and compensation and all that. The finance industry is dying. Talent-wise, we're being hollowed out as a nonsensical industry here. People are going into fun, exciting things like tech. There's a lot more freedoms. There seems to be a lot less kind of like leveling and social justice efforts there. And it's shocking because a lot of these tech firms are doing drastically crazy things with social justice efforts as well. But banking used to be, at least in like the 70s and 80s, all these heydays, right? Excitement and payment. It used to be meritocratic on the sense and the principles that you were compensated, you were paid based on your individual worth of who you were as a unique individual, right? So HR loves to bucket people based on experience and based on departments and based on all this stuff. And it's really frustrating from top performers, for example, because you don't pay people what they're actually worth at the top. And this is hollowing out finance, so we're losing a lot of our top talent. And on the quant side, right, you need a lot of really high-end talent that's super smart to solve these really complex problems. And yet we see, and I've been talking about this in video after video after video, we just don't have the talent in the industry anymore, right? We have thousands of graduates, thousands of degrees, top universities, and yet we can't really get good talent anymore. A lot of them end up going to other areas, other ventures, mom and pop startups, for example, because nobody wants to end up in this equalization nonsense where you're not being treated as a unique individual and being valued for who you are as a person. Okay, so let's dive into quant finance as a very specific piece here because I think this is being ignored and swept under the rug. So let's just start here with some of the nonsensical programs from banking to start with, and we'll dive into this. There are programs now, banks nationwide, they're donating just tons of money to a lot of these social justice causes, and it's really a marketing ploy. Okay, they might actually feel bad and think that they're giving money to these causes that's going to fix things. But again, they haven't used the data, they haven't looked at it, they're not trying to figure out what's really driving these issues and how do we address these as a society or even as a firm, right? If you want to have a strong culture. They're having trainings now that are basically anti-white trainings. So if you're an American and you're white, so those are kind of interesting things, you're all of a sudden deemed as a racist, and now they're trying to create trainings to let you know that, and somehow you're supposed to give different kind of aspects to other minorities because you feel bad for them. So I look at this and think, wow, you guys are extremely racist on your end for having these sorts of programs now, because now you're basically saying that minorities are not as good, so they're going to level this somehow. And you could take this as a perspective of trying to be more politically correct and saying, well, they're just disadvantaged. And I even had a firm, it was on the news somewhere, I'll see if I can find some articles and link them below, talking about that these minorities just don't understand, for example, finance, right? They're really struggling, so we're going to help them by financially educating them and making them better off. I'm like, this sounds pretty racist because you're not offering this to all poor people, right? It was sounding like from reading the article that it was only offered to a very specific minority group. It wasn't even offered to all minorities. So I called up a buddy of mine and I'm like, all right, dude, I feel like I'm a crazy person at this point. I've got to talk to us. I called actually a few different friends, but one of these sticks out. I said, doesn't this sound racist to you? Like, you're basically telling this group that they're stupid, they don't know anything. They work in banking with finance and accounting degrees, and now you're telling them the reason that there's an income I don't know, inequality, or the reason that, you aren't promoted or something is purely because of your race here. And so we're going to help you, and we're going to educate you, and we're going to teach you how to be financially responsible. Well, okay, a lot of these people work in a variety of different departments. So let's pretend they don't have finance and accounting degrees, but a lot of them do here. So again, we're stereotyping and saying all of them are the same, when a lot of them at a bank actually work in finance departments, so that's not really true. And you're basically saying they're stupid and that they need help and training. Now again, if there is an actual problem here and you could actually educate people financially, make them better off, shouldn't you just offer that to everybody? Like, I don't understand why we're segregating and creating groups now. And the final point here for the racial policies and things that I start to see is going to be these employee networks that they create. So every company has one. They even have heads of departments that do banking for this. So what do I mean by this? They'll have like an African-American employee network group, and it's specialized for them. And then they have a women's group that's only for women. And then they have like an Asian American group that's only for them. And then perhaps they split that one off and they have only a Chinese group and only an Indian group, right? And you have all these special groups and they all get the clubs and they get together, and that's fine, whatever. But why is the company sponsoring this, right? Why are we putting effort and time in this? Is it making people feel good, but it's not solving any problems? A lot of these groups too say, okay, we're going to let you meet the executives. You'll get special treatment and special promotions. It doesn't help you guys. I don't know why we're creating now a segregated industry and a banks, and like we're trying to say, oh, I'm in this camp and you're in that camp. And now you start having actually minorities that are upset with other groups because, again, one group's now getting a special treatment or something versus the other group. And now you're saying this minority is more valuable than this minority. It's just nonsense. I don't even know what's going on anymore, guys. It's just frustrating, to be honest. And I don't even care that like there's not like a special group I'm in. It's just causing a lot of these tensions now between the groups, and we're starting to have more divide somewhat that we're having in the political realm, where you're trying to create camps and groups so it's easier to kind of fight and say, oh, this is the bad guy, we're the good guys. And they're trying to justify essentially this leveling effect, which is not the principles of America. It's not a support of equality. It's kind of this socialist mentality where we're trying to level everybody and we don't really care about the inputs. So we don't care how hard you work. We just want to make sure everyone gets the same outputs here. So it's just nonsense. And to dive in this now in quant finance specifically, quant finance has a massive issue. And no matter who you talk to in the industry, they're going to agree with you, but they're not going to probably tell you to your face unless it's a private, closed conversation here. So let's lay out the demographics here so people understand quantitative finance, which again, as an entire industry, part of the banking industry, is being completely ignored and no one wants to talk about it because it defies a lot of what they're saying here. So the narrative is Americans are racist, okay? And yet, when you look at quant finance, about 5 to 10% of quants in quantitative finance are American. Okay, so think about that. That's a nationalist stat. This is not like a gender or race or anything. This is as a national stat. So white Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, right? It doesn't matter. Americans only make up between 5 and 10% of all the employees in quantitative finance. Okay, that's the first piece here. Now the second piece, again, looking at these descriptive stats here we talked about, so that's that American piece. The vast majority of quantitative finance is going to be Asian. So it'll be either Chinese or Indian or somewhere kind of in that realm. The vast majority of quantitative finance is going to be from that area. There are, again, a few Europeans and South Americans and Africans, for example, so you actually come from these different kind of continents. But it's not very common. Again, it's predominantly Asian. So again, we still don't have a problem at this point, okay? And at first I started thinking about one example. And then it was a second example, and a third example, and a fourth example, and a fifth example. So I'm like, okay, is it anecdotal evidence? Like I'm just seeing this one issue, or do we have an actual systemic racist problem or a nationalist problem, probably more per se in quant finance, depending on what country you actually come from? But we have a problem with that more so. I think that's the issue we need to focus on and look at. So I started asking and pulling a lot of friends and colleagues. As soon as I mentioned the topic, it was like everyone looked around to see if anyone else was around. Or if it's on a private call, right, it kind of quiets down just naturally. And these individuals are complaining and listing up all these issues they're seeing. So I'm like, this can't be an anecdotal evidence here. It's not like I have a story or a example, right? Things just happen, right? There are just bad people here and there. It's really coming down to an industry-wide problem. And I'll give you an example of this. So the problem we have is that one country, so you have someone from one of these countries, will be the leader or the head of a department, and they end up hiring predominantly their entire staff being that exact nationality here. Okay. Then you start looking at promotions within here too, and you start looking at the data again. So I've got my pencil here and I've got paper and I'm like taking notes out. I started trying to go through the data I have mentally of who got promoted, whose team were they on, these sorts of things. And it was this consistent story. You see one grouping or one head would be from one country, and they predominantly hire and promote within the same kind of nationality here. And yet it's not even bank specific, it can be team specific. So there are teams I've seen that have been mainly Italian. There are teams I've seen that are mainly Indian, that are mainly Chinese, that are mainly Russian. And I'm sure if you go to a variety of different banks, I'm sure there's ones that are American as well, but you see predominantly promotions and hires in the exact same ones. And it's really kind of weird and kind of a messed up system. So you start talking to a lot of individuals and a lot of people from other countries. So surprise, surprise to many of you in the United States. It's not wrong for them to say, I'm Chinese or I'm Indian or I'm, whatever, fill in the nationality here. I like working with people that are just like me, right? They think like me, they act like me. And so in America, we're fighting this sort of a synthetic bias or problem they think that's going on here. And yet there's actual problems in other countries where they actually do believe that, my group is smarter than the rest of them. And I've had people tell me this, my nationality is better than the rest of them, and that's why. So you can give them training, but training's not going to fix it, right? They're not going to say, okay, don't hire people like you solely based on the fact that they're like you. You need to find people that are good kind of candidates and good fits based on the job and the skills required. And yet we see a lot of people in the industry that aren't qualified, and yet you start looking who hired them, what teams do they work on, where are the promotions at? And yet we actually do have a nationalist, or you could call it a racist, I guess, perhaps. There's probably more of a nationalist issue here where they keep hiring and promoting the exact same ones. Training's not going to fix it, okay? Now, let's go back to the original discussion on leveling and creating fields. I don't think we should level the fields either. So Americans make up 5 to 10% based on the data I've been looking at, my personal examples and teams I've worked at. But again here, I don't think we should try to say, okay, Americans should make up, 50%. Let's just pick a percentage here. They should make 50% of this. I don't think we should do that, right? And now let's think about why is this? Why don't I agree with this? Well, one, there are a whole lot more Chinese and Indians that have the skill sets, the education, and the backgrounds to actually work in quantitative finance. So we shouldn't be leveling it just because it's not equally split based on US demographics. We shouldn't be labeling or splitting or any of that nonsense based on global demographics, though it starts to kind of play in your mind of like, okay, this kind of makes sense why we have more Chinese and Indians versus other groups. You now have to look at how many degrees do you have. So Americans don't typically have a lot of math, STEM related degrees. So, engineering and sciences and all that. We don't typically have a lot of them. And then it's also not very common and very popular in America to go into quantitative finance. It's not a hot topic. If you go to China, you go to India, for example, it is a huge kind of driving force there that they want to end up in quantitative finance. It's a whole career, it's a whole industry. It's what people are really driving for. It's a goal that a lot of them are working at. So there's thousands and thousands and thousands of applications to these graduate programs, for example. Only a small percentage of those ones end up getting in, and then eventually end up getting into the industry. But again, we have more people that are more qualified from these groups, so I would expect to see more Chinese and Indians. So I don't think that's an issue. The issue is going to come down to hiring and promotion and trying to make sure that these are being done correctly. And again, corporations need to look into this and make sure it's being done correctly, that we don't have that racist or nationalist kind of issue that's playing into the hiring and the promotion. It just ruins the meritocracy that we have in America. And yes, I've talked to people that are adamantly against America that work in these institutions. They hate America. They don't like the system. They want it to be predominantly their groupings, which sounds kind of nonsensical and crazy. And yet I run into these constantly. So let's give an example here, just as an anecdotal evidence here, right? It's not actual proof, but it does kind of help show the storyline here. There was an individual that ran a team from a country that's, I think, over like 75 plus of one of the, so you rank countries from largest to smallest, number one's the largest, it's like 75 plus. So it's a really tiny country. Population-wise, there's just not a lot of people there, okay? And then you start looking at the rigor in the mathematics. So, maybe there are countries that specialize in mathematics and sciences, so maybe this country is predominantly known for that. So started digging and doing research. No, they're not known for that either. So it's like, okay, so you have this tiny country with a manager from it, no big deal. Doesn't have any red flags. But then they go out and they hire someone. And the first person they hire for this team is, again, from the exact same country. Okay? Again, I don't think we should jump to any conclusions. Then the third person they hire, and then up being the fourth person they hire. And this is a really small team. So you're looking at like, there's 3 or 4 hires all based on this one manager from a country in the middle of nowhere that is extremely small and doesn't have the educational background. Then when you look at the candidates that were hired, none of them actually had the credentials to do the job either. Right? Like, this should raise a red flag inside of HR or inside of, the department, and yet it was actually being supported by many individuals up the chain as well. And it's like, well, they're the manager, that's who they chose to hire, right? We can't do anything about it. So when I talked about this at the very beginning in banking, right, let's get down to those root causes. Let's figure out the root cause problem. Let's not just tack a Band-Aid on this. So the tack a Band-Aid approach would be like, I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist, but I kind of hear inklings and complaints from other employees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay these other employees slightly more to make them feel better, right? Because they're not getting promoted, for example. That's not a good policy. You need to figure out this person, this individual is the problem. So the solution would be you either talk to them and say, hey, this is not acceptable at our firm, our bank, our institution, whatever. You cannot just blatantly discriminate against people based on promotions and hiring because you want people that look like you are from your country. Okay, so that's the first piece. The second piece is you should consider firing them if the issue continues. So you don't just fire them off the bat. Right? Try to escalate this, go through the logic. Perhaps they had a feeder program, or perhaps they knew super great individuals, again, that were hired based on their individual traits and skills, and they just happen to know people from similar backgrounds based on networking and all that. But that wasn't the case, right? Their educational backgrounds didn't even match the jobs that they were getting. So these are sorts of things. This is how you would address these issues in quantitative finance, is going after these departments, trying to figure out why there's a disparity in different nationalities, right? Is who's doing the hiring, who's pushing for promotions. So a lot of times when people get hired, which people don't know, there's interviews across a variety of managers and people. So you interview across a variety. This is great practice because it helps kind of reduce these issues with biases based on, gender, age, nationality, race, sexual orientation, all these sorts of things here. But at the same time, if you have people that are complying on multiple levels, it makes it a lot easier for it to happen. And I think this could have been what was happening, is there's multiple levels of people that liked each other and they just kind of let things slide. Again, where is HR in this? Where is senior management? Right? I know there's other employees that were complaining about it, and yet nothing's being done at these institutions, and this is where the crux of the problem lies. You want to seem good with the national public here, right? The social justice movement. I saw an entire article, which I'll probably try to share below as well, talking about how you should bank at small community banks. You should find banks that are minority ran, because these minorities will treat their friends and family differently. It's like, okay, now you're saying it's a racist bank and a racist institution, and yet if you look at it, a lot of times the bigger banks have better models, better practices, better policies, and can provide you better products, cheaper interest rates, for example, for loans and credit cards with less fees. But again, you're encouraging people not to do that because you're trying to force these banks into a position where they have to take a social justice cause approach. They have to donate money. And I think the bank should stand up and say, we're not going to put up with this. We stand up for equality and fairness. And this is not equal. This is not fair for anybody involved. Again, right, you start looking at different groups, minorities, who's being treated differently, why are they being treated differently? And then if you take this into consideration at all for hiring or promotion, right? There are programs at these different banks where they have said, we will give you a leg up because of your minority, but only this one minority. And if it works great, we might let other minorities into this, secretive group here. This is complete nonsense. It should not be occurring here. I don't know what else to say about this at this point. I'm just super frustrated because it's not even just me that's complaining. It's colleagues after colleagues after colleagues at all these different banks and institutions, right? When I say colleagues, I mean people in the industry. We're all kind of a family and a grouping here. Guys, it's tough. And you got to realize this video is really tough for me to make as well because I do put myself in a really bad position with all banks, right? This video is now going to be public, so people are going to be viewing this and thinking about, are we doing things right or wrong? Does it make us look bad? Dimitri's not making an industry look good. We can just oust him and get rid of him to make these things look better. So it's kind of a risk on my end to actually talk about it, and that's why I've been advised not to talk about these topics. But I think we need to take a data approach. So as a summary on this, take a data approach. If we do have problems, there are problems that exist. Let's use data to identify those problems, like academically using the scientific method. And then as in the quant example, let's figure out how do we solve this, right? These aren't easy problems to solve either. So Do we have to get rid of specific employees? Do we have to tell them? Again, doing nonsensical training like bias training and all this isn't going to solve your problem, right? HR needs to look at it. Management needs to look at it. Everybody needs to be hands on deck and figuring out how these things work. But I just don't see this in the industry. And again, talking from friends and other people in other industries as well, so colleagues in other industries, they're seeing similar things. People are frustrated. People are debating on leaving. So leaving the United States, leaving other countries are having similar policies now and trying to find where to exit to get better opportunities. So we're actually losing good talent, because I know they're good talent. We're losing good talent because people just don't want to deal with this anymore. So things to think about, things to deal with. I want to see the quant industry change as a whole. I want to see banking and finance change as a whole. I want to see some executives stand up and do the right thing here instead of just playing into the media and the politics and looking for, kind of a handout or a kickback or an increase in marketing and kind of employees and I don't know, all this nonsense that's going on, how they benefit from it's pretty, unethical in many ways because they're doing it as a marketing ploy but pretending they're caring. And yet I just don't see there being an actual lot of data and analytics going to actually creating unique solutions to solve these problems instead of just band-aiding everything. So anyways, thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until next time.